Hello and welcome to the LLG vlog. I'm Helen McGrath, LLG's Executive Director of Policy and Governance, and I am delighted to be joined by a special guest, Ian Morris, who is the Town Clerk at Spennymoor Town Council and a Board Director of the Society of Local Council Clerks, and they're often referred to as SLCC. Welcome, Ian.
Hi, Helen. Yeah, thanks for inviting me.
Now, we've got a very interesting topic for discussion, and it might not be something you've even heard of before. Indeed, if you Google it, you're going to find very little about it specifically. And yet it might just be the next big thing gripping the sector. So what are we talking about? Well, it's micro-devolution. Now, Ian, this is something you've got a massive interest in. So perhaps you could explain the concept of micro-devolution. What is it?
So, micro-devolution is about devolving power and accountability to local places. It's really that simple. It's writ large and levelling up. It features in the main political parties' manifesto pledges. It's been talked about in think tanks on both sides of the political divide. The Labour manifesto talks about growth in every corner of the country so that every town, village and city has a role. The new Take Back Control Act that they're proposing talks about this presumption towards devolution, generating growth at every town, city, a full fat approach to devolution, they're calling it. They're talking about devolution being essential for taking on regional inequality and unlocking pride. Now, from my perspective as a chief officer and town clerk of a town council, when I talk about micro-devolution, I'm talking about the potential for the devolution of community-based services to a small town in County Durham. In my area, in County Durham, we've got a huge unitary county authority that covers the socially, economically and environmentally and politically diverse 860 odd miles, serves over 500,000 people, £1.3 billion annual budget, but it's also got over 100 parish and town councils. And the concept of micro-devolution can equally apply to non-parished areas, but I'm sort of coming at it from the perspective of the parish sector at the moment. You know, the local government sector is in financial crisis. The LGA, I think, recently reported a £6.2 billion funding gap over the next 3 years. And as many principal authorities are looking upwards at devolution through the new mayoral combined authorities, 2/3 of councils have already had to make cutbacks to local neighbourhood services this year. And that's like waste collections, road repairs, library, leisure services. 48% of local authorities are reporting cuts to parks and green spaces provision, 34% talking about cuts to museums, galleries and theatres. Half of principal local authorities have warned that they're likely to declare bankruptcy on Section 114 notices in the next 5 years. So principal local authorities are stuck between a rock and a hard place, but in parished areas, there's another tier of local government that has the potential to take up the slack on local services. And in some parts of England, that's already happening, but it's patchy to say the least. And it can be really heavy lifting for local practitioners in the field. Traditional approaches to kind of codified partnerships and memorandums of understanding between a council and its parishes, you know, that's not going to work for this. It's not going to cut the mustard. So we need to think about a new way to approach micro-devolution. The local government family, I think, we need to work together to work out how we can deliver this micro-devolution agenda that seems to be coming down the political lines. And that's really my starting point for this debate.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. I mean, like you said, there are examples. I mean, London, for instance, Queen's Park had a pop-up parish to deal with, really localized issues. And the LGA, if you pull up their devolution documents and guidance, they do talk about micro government. It's the same thing when we talk about micro devolution. And in fact, I've seen agile devolution as well, coined as a term, but about how they can pop up. I think they could have a limited lifespan even to deal with a specific interest to the community, which could be dealing with graffiti, planting trees, all manner of things. But it's like you said, it's about how that is more effectively distributed throughout England. And I will just say, actually, and I sort of said at the outset, we are talking about England here at the moment. We're not addressing the question in Wales at the moment for our Welsh members. So, I mean, in the backdrop of all of that, what do you think could be achieved, like really achieved, if there was a will to move ahead with micro-devolution?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, like last year, I completed a master's in public leadership, and my dissertation subject was around collaborative innovation between local parish and town councils and their principal authorities. Now, I interviewed senior managers, so heads of service and directors for some big principal authorities in parished areas, and about their attitudes towards working with local councils in their area. And the responses were, let's say, mixed. But one quote really catches the sentiment perfectly for me. A director from a really large unitary authority said to me that if officers in parish and town councils have the right traits and attitudes to start, then magic can happen. And I think that's my starting point. Like what can be achieved is magic at a very hyper local level. So in 2016, NALC, the National Association of Local Councils, carried out a survey, and 70% of local councils, that's parish and town councils, identified at least one local service that they would like to take from their principal authority. And across England, there's already pockets of micro-devolution deals between local authorities and their local parish and town councils. Wiltshire Town Council and Wiltshire Council and Trowbridge Town Council have agreed a service delegation package, and the Town Council has taken on full delegated responsibility for a range of public realm services, maintenance of all green spaces, amenity land, highway verges, litter collection and disposal, street cleaning. You mentioned graffiti. So that package of delegated services were expected to save Wiltshire Council £365,000 last financial year. Chippenham Town Council have been through a process again with Wiltshire Council. That Chippenham Town Council have taken on street sweeping, litter collection, grass cutting, tree maintenance, allotments, parks, open spaces, the 50-acre town centre park. There was no transfer of funding from the principal authority to Chippenham Town Council, and Wiltshire's own reports projected well over £500,000 of savings in 2019-20 and 2020-21 alone. Cornwall County Council have been working with I think it's Launceston. I'm not quite sure how to pronounce it. Apologies for any colleagues from Cornwall.
Can't help you there.
On a Safer Greener Street project. So the town council has led bids for external grant funding. They've set up a group alongside the county council officers and members, Chamber of Commerce and what have you. And the town council's taken on a project to elevate the public realm of the town, heritage, culture work, and there, that's the town council leading on that on behalf of the county council. And in Buckinghamshire Council, they've set out an agenda of devolution of services to town and parish councils. They've done a lot of work, and we might talk about this later, I suppose, around almost from a governance and due diligence perspective. So they've set out devolved services around grass cutting, sign cleaning, litter and clutter removal, pavement work. And so there they've actually published some technical clarification notes and operational method statements that kind of de-risks local community groups taking on some of those services for themselves. So I think what can be achieved is it's a really wide range of mix. It's predominantly about local community-based services. We're not talking here about schools or about adult social care or anything like that.
Yeah.
Local community services, the very things that quite often non-statutory services or marginally statutory services that mean an awful lot to local communities can mean an awful lot to local politicians, but principal authorities are increasingly struggling to deliver given the financial pressures that they're under. I think this issue is philosophical insofar as the concept of localized government and micro local government and agile government or whatever. But it's also very practical in terms of the incredible financial pressures that the principal authorities are finding themselves under.
Well, I mean, you've just laid out a plethora there of excellent examples of where it's been really beneficial, and it's great that Buckinghamshire have indeed published some of their clarification notes there to assist anybody else who's thinking about doing the same thing. Apologies, by the way, for leaning back there. I had a technical issue I had to address, so fortunately we weren't interrupted. But one of the things I struggle with, and because at the moment there's lots of words. It's very kind of, it's almost, as you said, theoretical, even though we're seeing pockets of practice. And I just wonder whether you'd applied any thought to whether, or rather how, micro-devolution actually take place in practice on a much larger scale.
Yeah, so I suppose there's a little bit of chicken and egg here. So I suppose on one hand we say, like, to what extent is this going to be a political priority locally? You know, to what extent is the monitoring officer or the treasurer or the chief executive going to be getting it in the neck from the leadership about micro-devolution? Is it on their agenda? And I think in some places it has been, so that, you know, that's come from the sort of political leadership, the members themselves driving this forward. But I'm also a huge believer that, you know, in local government, as senior professionals, our role is to advise members and sometimes to introduce new ideas to them as well. So I think in some areas this could actually be very much driven by senior professions in local government sort of working together. So I think the how could actually come from a small number of senior practitioners in a locality saying, look, we need to think about something different here, create that narrative about what we're trying to do, and then I'll take that to the members for sort of some feedback. And I think a lot of that really is about, we need just that time and capacity to think about what it means locally. You know, time and capacity is such,
Yeah.
So hard to come across nowadays, and there's so many of the priorities. But I think, you know, as a practitioner, I'm currently trying to warm that pot. I'm briefing my town councillors, county councillors, including sort of political group leaders about this concept. I've written a briefing paper about it. More words, not action that you're calling for, Helen. And I've also been speaking to my excellent monitoring officer about how we might approach this in a new way in County Durham. So I think, you know, I think it's something that may come through the political route, but I think it's, you know, it's also very likely that it might just be senior officers getting their heads around this and saying, right, let's see what we can do with it.
Yeah, I think there's definitely going to be needed a period of time to do just that, actually, because like I said, I don't think it's to my mind, and I'd love a member to tell me if I'm wrong, because I would like to be able to track the origins of this, but it's a new concept. It's a new way of thinking. It's not new in the sense that devolution has been around obviously for a good while, but it's kind of a more a nuanced element within devolution as a whole package, I would say. So as much as we might want to think about how to put this into practice, I think as a lawyer, we always start from what are the issues here? What you know, what could go wrong, or indeed what are the blockers to devolution? What would you say the blockers to devolution are? Micro-devolution.
Well,
I'll be
yeah,
careful
sure.
there.
Well, so from a sort of academic perspective, there's a couple of leading academics around sort of collaboration and collaborative innovation, Eva Sorensen and Jacob Torfing. They're well worth reading if you can get hold of the journals. But they produced a paper in 2011 enhancing collaborative innovation in the public sector, and they identified a number of barriers, cultural, institutional, organizational, identity level barriers. And my own academic research has kind of pretty much corroborated that findings, but in a very local area, very contingent on local circumstances, the people, the history, the culture, the politics, the administrative mechanisms, staffing capacity in very difficult times. So, you know, there are definitely some real kind of blockers for that micro-devolution happening. I do think that there's definitely a governance issue to consider. I think, you know, the parish and town council sector is subject to a significantly lighter touch external audit regime than our principal local authorities are. We're not subject to the best value regime. We're not subject to the Office for Local Government or an OFLOG, or we're not subject to the Local Government and Social Care Ombudsman. So in a way, that freedom from some of those sort of regimes is refreshing in a way, but that minimal level of external regulation should be balanced by something else. And I think that's where some kind of non-statutory local government sector-led governance framework for devolution might be timely. So a framework like that could be concerned with de-risking local micro-devolution discussions. I mentioned earlier the Buckinghamshire thing, where they've done some work very practically looking at sort of capturing the key standards and requirements for very local services. But it could be more broad than that. It could looking at issues around procurement. If we're devolving services and potentially funding, how do we make sure that that they're being properly procured, financial management, internal audit, constitution, risk, openness and transparency. Like, there's a number of things that I think we could do to sort of de-risk that environment at a local level. And I do think that there's room for something to be done at a kind of macro level across our sector, local government sector, about that. And you're right, we're not really talking about this, not the micro-devolution stuff. But I also think that part of the solution will always be local. So, I'm in the early stages of these conversations with my monitoring officer, and we're going to try and do some thinking around how we might be able to do something with this. But other monitoring officers in parished areas might want to get in touch with their local SLCC branch. My professional body is arranged into local branches. Start that conversation. Start talking about those things locally. It's a massive thing for us as a profession in the local council sector at the moment, and you will be able to find local practitioners who are happy to talk about this and try and work out practically how could this thing work locally. So yeah, I think there are barriers there, that they are real. They are very locally contingent. It's every locality that's thinking about doing this will have different things to deal with. But I do think there's some stuff that we could do, as sector bodies, or across the local government family, potentially working with SIPLA and Solace as well, to sort of look at how we might set a framework that starts to de-risk some of these conversations.
Well, I mean, LLG are always open to discussions, post general election, obviously, but that's only next week. We would want to examine the nuances, seek membership views, and we've yet to have a discussion at board level. But as I say, more than happy to have that discussion. I mean, in terms of blockers, I did a bit of research myself, and it does back up some of the stuff you were saying. If you look at the Reform website, they talk about a capacity gap, about England lacking regional governance structures and existing councils facing, resource constraints, as you've mentioned, making the prospect of this quite challenging. And I think if you're always fighting fires, very difficult to start thinking about how to bring in new concepts. Well, it can be an impediment to doing so, but it doesn't mean it necessarily should be, but I can see how that can happen. They talk about a capability gap. So this is around a lack of confidence in an ability for regional authorities to effectively manage devolved powers. That's interesting. An accountability gap. You were touching on that, the persistent reliance on central oversight. And what the Reform website says are perceived or actual weaknesses in local accountability mechanisms. And then they talk about a culture gap. And this is where it gets a little bit more controversial, around not wanting to give away central power. They actually use much stronger terms than that on their website. But we are about to go into a general election. There are a number of polls which we were aware of in terms of what might happen there. But and you talked about this earlier, the Labour Party manifesto talks about widening devolution to more areas and encouraging authorities to come together. And there's some commentators, there was an article in the MJ recently about this, because some commentators are saying this will take time and energy away from deepening devolution in the areas which already have it. Before we go on to that, I will just say, for balance, that, and you said that it does feature in most of the major parties' manifestos, the Conservative manifesto states that by 2030, every part of England that wants one will have a devolution deal. And they talk about offering a level 4 devolution powers to areas in England with a devolution deal and a directly elected leader. And for some reason, they're starting with the Tees Valley. We can only guess and surmise why that might be. The Liberal
as a Tees Valley resident, I can say it's a great place to start.
And the Liberal Democrats, they talk about decentralising decision making from Whitehall and Westminster by inviting local areas to take control of the services that matter to them most. So I didn't see anything in the Green Party manifesto. It doesn't mean it's not there. They're all laid out very differently, manifestos, which is interesting in and of itself. So all three all three of those parties I've just mentioned are pledging a commitment to devolution, whatever that looks like to them. So what are your views on the effect of widening devolution on existing devolved areas, do you think?
So I suppose where I start from this is that, and this I suppose is getting back to your point of it, we need to move away from just talking about it and think about the practical limitations. When we're talking about the sort of principal local authority sectors involvement in devolution, I can't get myself away from the starting point, which is the £6.2 billion funding gap. So we're talking about devolution to a sector that is massively underfunded. That's not a central government, just generally just doesn't have enough money to operate as it is now, and yet we're talking about devolution, and that in the current economic climate, that's always going to be a very tricky thing. And so I think there are some real concerns about how capable the sector is of sort of dealing with absorbing this devolution agenda that seems to be coming through all the main political parties. And I think it's clear that whatever the colour of the new national administration, there's no funding miracle on the horizon. That £6.2 billion gap is not going to close overnight. So things are going to remain tough for us, right? Time and energy is going to remain a scant resource, whatever happens with the political changes over the next few weeks. So I think that, but I do think that across the local government sector, we need to look in the mirror and ask ourselves whether we're doing enough on this subject. Like, time and energy may be in short supply, but the issues facing our communities are as pressing as ever, and we remain both highly centralised and also regionally disparate. So if we want that to change, if as practitioners with that strong public service ethos, we're trying to make a change in our communities, right? Otherwise, why on earth are we doing this job? We think that something needs to change. We're all part of the same narrative around decentralization. We're too highly centralized, etc. So we're going to need to do something different in order to perform these devolution things in a different way. And as Stephen Covey said, we can't talk ourselves out of a problem that we behaved ourselves into. So I think that means we're going to have to behave differently, and that's what keeps on bringing me back to this micro-devolution thing. As the principal authorities, the local authorities in the areas are looking sort of upwards into these regional or sub-regional combined authorities, and the decentralized powers and funds that we believe are going to be flowing soon, then actually I think we need to think about this micro-devolution idea as a way for those authorities to be able to build some capacity to deal with the stuff that's coming down from the higher level, by micro-devolving community-based services to, from my perspective, parish and town councils. But you're quite right, I think you mentioned before, that there are other ways of doing that in non-parished areas. There are other things that you can do, including sort of pop-up parishes or what have you. But I think it's like a piece of the jigsaw on this wider macro-devolution decentralization process, that local authorities aren't just thinking about staying as they are and having more devolved services. It's be part of devolved services and think about micro-devolving down to the community level as well.
I think, there will be work to do to look at the law actually, regardless, because there are peculiarities around combined authorities in respect to discharge of functions, as an example. But I think, that's not, almost in this whole discussion, that's almost the easier thing. And normally it's the biggest stumbling block. So it just depends. If there's a will, there's a way, basically. But I think you mentioned Stephen Covey. I believe he also said that your most important work is always ahead of you, never behind you, Ian. So who knows what you might achieve in the future in relation to this. Do you think we'll hear a lot more about micro-devolution post the general election? We'll certainly hear it from you, and people can expect me to be involved in those discussions. But just generally in the sector, do you think this is going to be the next big talking shop, so to speak?
Yeah, I do think you'll hear more about it. I think particularly in parished areas. So again, as a sector, the parish and town council sector, both SLCC and NALC, who we work very closely with, we're having these discussions about how we sort of frame our sector's capacity and desire to work with our local government siblings in a different way, particularly focused around the financial crisis, but also as part of this wider devolution agenda. So I do think it's something that you'll be hearing as our profession and our sector, our part of the sector, brings that forward. We're looking at taking this to like a national conference potentially later this year. And certainly personally, I'm going to be hearing a lot about it. I have a almost like a geeky interest in this, and I'm currently considering a PhD where I focus on this a little bit more as well. So yes, I will definitely be thinking about this. I'd also go as far as to say that if it's not being talked about in, viewers watching this thinking micro-devolution, we've not talked about this at corporate management team, this isn't coming down from the political leadership, then I'd go as far as to say that if it's not being talked about in your locality now, then start the conversation. Because it's a thing, and going back to it, like that the getting it away from just being talk and being action is going to mean local practitioners taking this on and pushing it forward. So yeah, I definitely think we'll be hearing more about micro-devolution post general election.
Well, it's absolutely fascinating discussion, Ian. I'd love to have you back again for further discussion on this once we know a little bit more post general election, and perhaps we could get someone from Now along on that as well. Just for anyone wanting to learn a little bit more around the impact and possibilities of devolution, Jonathan Warren, who is the CEO at Lecalis, he posts some really interesting stuff actually, and you can either have a look at their website or go onto his LinkedIn to have a look. I think he posted something yesterday, literally on devolution as it happens. So many thanks for joining me today, Ian. Do give our regards to SLCC, and good luck with considering that PhD of yours. If it's worth anything, I think you should do it. Go for it.
Thanks, Helen. Thanks very much for having me.
Take care. All the best.